Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the last plenary session of the conference, Hope into Action. And I'd like to welcome everybody online and those of you in the room. And there will be a few people dribbling into the room as we get started. But my job is really a lovely one here. I'm here to introduce the two keynote speakers who are going to be in conversation on the challenges of inequality for policy and research. And we've got a conversation that's really an intercontinental conversation. So joining us down the line from Mexico City, you can see it on our screen, is Ricardo Fuentes-Nieva, who's Director of the Overseas Development Institute's Equity and Social Policy Programme. Previously, he held senior roles in Oxfam Mexico and Oxfam GB. He's an internationally respected economist, and he authored the UNDP Human Development Report. So we're really grateful to you for joining us, and we're just very sorry, Ricardo, that we couldn't fly you over to be here actually in the room. But he's going to be in conversation with Professor Diego Sanchez-Ancochea, who is, well, he wears many hats. He's Associate Head for People in the Social Sciences Division in the University of Oxford, and he's also Head of the Oxford Department of International Development. And his research specialises in the political economy of Latin America, especially the determinants of income inequality and the role of social policy in reducing this. And his engagement and impact work focuses on multinational organisations such as UNDP and ILO. So, Diego and Ricardo, I'm going to shuffle off into the audience now and leave you to have a conversation. So, thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you, Eileen, for the invitation. I mean, in this weird place in between, but I'll try to actually be with both. As Heather said, Ricardo and I wanted to really do this as informally as possible and have a conversation about inequality based on the fact that we have crossed both worlds that we are interested in this conference. In my case, more in the academia case, clearly in Ricardo's case, playing a big impact in the debates internationally on inequality. I think we will talk for around 30 minutes, just with different questions, and then we'll just open up for any questions, comments, and your own experiences on this topic or related. So, Ricardo, if that's okay, I will start with a question to you, and then we'll follow from there. Which is, if we think about the research primarily, and thinking about economics and political economy, I think more than other disciplines, how do you think that the research on inequality has changed in the last 20 years or so, and what have been the main innovations that you see during that period?
Thank you, Diego, and good morning from Mexico City. Thank you, the organizers, for the invitation to this conference. I'm very pleased to be here. Diego, I cannot hear you that well, so if you can put the microphone closer to your mouth when you speak, I think that'll help me kind of listen to you better. But I did get the question, and I think I mean it's an important initial question, and I think the first kind of disclaimer is that my work has been focusing on economic inequality mostly, and then when I'll be talking, and I know Diego has worked on this aspect too, on economic inequality, we still need to recognize that there are other angles to study inequality, and that's why many people, when they refer to this problem, they prefer to talk about inequalities. But in the case of economic inequality, what we've seen over the past couple of decades is a massive change in how we understand the problem. I remember when I started my career as a young research assistant in Washington in the late 90s. I was working at the Inter-American Development Bank, and that was the time, when the narrative was that growth is good for the poor. When Ann Kruger, around that time, who was held a very high position in the IMF, would say that, like, I mean, discussing inequality was a distraction to the real problems in the world. And now we see that, like, I mean, the inequality discussion is everywhere. In policymakers, in civil society, in think tanks, in academia, you know, so there is a big change. So what happened, you know, in those kind of like 2.5 decades? Well, what happened, according to, you know, like, I mean, my understanding is three things. One is a massive data revolution. So the work that Piketty, Saez, and the great and late Tony Atkinson, who used to be at University of Oxford, led on the distribution at the top end, or the how the concentration of income was being distributed at the 1% and the 0.1% using tax returns. That was kind of a massive shift. But that's not the only one, you know. Like, I mean, the now kind of like problem, the Credit Suisse has been publishing a big database on the distribution of wealth around the world as opposed to income, and that's a database that we used in those kind of initial inequality Oxfam papers 10 years ago. So data is one thing, and this will help us kind of like, I mean, guide the discussion further. But the other thing, and then you mentioned it, Diego, is kind of like, I mean, a closer look to institutions and political economy in the academic research. And I think the work that Acemoglu and Robinson led, but like many other people too, kind of like forced us to think about distribution of decision-making power and how institutions reflect that, you know. And then the natural next step is to focus on the distribution of resources, you know, and the distribution of decision-making power. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing that caught us, kind of like caught up with us, was kind of like these shocks to the hyper-globalized capitalist system, best represented by the crisis in 2008, 2009, and the reaction, the Occupy Wall Street, for instance, that very clearly said, like, we're the 99%, and we're kind of like, I mean, it was very clear for many people that there was something wrong with the system, and that part of what was wrong in the system was that kind of enormous concentration of income and wealth, and all the social ills that you worked a lot on, Diego, for instance, you know. So those are the kind of like three things that I see in kind of like, I mean, what has changed over the couple of decades. But then, I mean, as part of this conversation, Diego, like, I mean, let me then ask a question to you, which is, we've seen that, like, I mean, because we've been talking about inequality for, you know, many years now. Like that first Oxfam paper that I wrote was published in January 2014. You know, that's almost that's more than 9 years ago, and yet we see very little changes in policies and in the trends and things like that. But like when we look at history, we see that, like, I mean, that doesn't need to be the case. You know, that history kind of like, I mean, shows us that things can change, and that policy is really important, state intervention and the like. So Diego, what do you see as kind of like, I mean, the lessons from history, and what do we need to start discussing in terms of policy for that?
So that's a great question, and I hope you can you hear me better now, or?
Yep.
Okay,
yeah, I can hear you better.
Shout as well. So I think before I answer the question, this issue of the data that you were mentioning, I think is extremely important in the context of, in the context of a conference like the one we have had today, right? In that you're right that inequality has been discussed in many angles, but this issue of the very rich having a lot of income has been something that the data and researchers, first in academia, but then people like you outside academia, have actually been very successful at first highlighting and then packaging in ways that have shifted the conversation totally, right? And I think as we think about data, and we think about the intersection between data and impact, this is probably one of the best examples. There's so many graphs that, again, both academics like Piketty, but also organizations like Oxfam showed showing the significant increase on the very rich, and really reframing inequality as being about the very rich having many more resources. That I think it's one of the case studies in a couple of days that we have had a lot of case studies. But you asked me about the subsequent question, which is why we haven't advanced so little, but especially how we could advance more. And again, I think that's where researchers have also been extremely successful, and where comparative research from different parts of the world becomes extremely important, right? So I think it's important to understand that the research on inequality appears and develops first in the context of the OECD countries. So there's a lot of comparisons between, for example, the Scandinavian countries and the more Anglo-Saxon economies like the UK and the US, which start showing some of the different dimensions in which the reduction of inequality can be achieved. And maybe we can then go, Ricardo, to why it hasn't been achieved. And I will pass you that question to you in a second, because that's a much harder one to answer. And some of the reasons, again, have been illuminated through a combination of case studies and quantitative research, which I think also highlights and links to some of the issues discussed in the conference. So, for example, we know that industrial policy is important, that the type of jobs that we create in the economies is important, but of course, there is not just about developing much more high-tech sectors of the economy, as sometimes we assume, but it's also about how those sectors bring the rest of the economy with them. In Costa Rica, there has been work in which people talk about industrial policy with two motors. One in which you develop new sectors, or you copy from high productivity activities in other parts of the world, but the other is the labor-intensive activities, many of the ones that take place in the urban sector, which end up creating a lot of jobs. I think the second is an important lesson. It's about the importance of social policy. As Heather very nicely said in the introduction, I do a lot of work with a colleague from Costa Rica, Juliana Martinez, which I wish she was here with us as well. And we have shown how universal social policy has been extremely important in some of the most successful countries in the Global South, Costa Rica being a good example, Uruguay being another. But of course, it's also what characterizes countries like Sweden, like Finland, and is what is missing in the case of the US, a country where inequality has increased very significantly. And I think the third one is how we regulate markets. So in particular, how we regulate the financial markets and how we regulate the labor market, and what's the role of trade unions, goes a long way in understanding inequality. But of course, all of that, and again, I think it links to discussions and thinking about impact, is a little bit irrelevant if you don't think about politics. At the end, fighting inequality is not just about designing the best policies possible. We know a lot of the things that need to be done, but it's about power, and it's about power distribution, which of course it's something that people that work on policy know sometimes better than academics, and it's also something that clearly political science understand more than economics. And it might be that when one thinks about power, we immediately enter into a window of why inequality has actually not gone down very significantly, right? That it has been as much as not adopting the right policies as the fact that this is a fight between some groups of the population that have significant power and the rest which struggle to influence the debates in the similar ways. But I'm sure there's other reasons why you feel the agenda has not advanced as much as it should have.
That's a really interesting point, and one in which I totally agree. But like, I mean, then the question, like, I mean, the question that comes is like, how then we can redistribute that power, or how we can kind of like, I mean, rebalance the power distribution, so as to achieve that. And then looking at kind of what happened in many countries after the Second World War, which has been identified as that kind of period in history where we saw a massive decline in the concentration of income and wealth. What we've seen is kind of like, I mean, several things. One was kind of like state intervention. So the states were very responsive, given kind of like, I mean, the enormity of the crisis of the Second World War. And in the US also kind of like, I mean, previously the Great Depression. So governments and public administrations and the state apparatus were very keen on kind of avoiding kind of like a social fallout, and started investing very heavily on programs that were redistributing resources and were kind of like involving people in the decision making. That's why unions were so important back in the day, and kind of like, I mean, the union of unions that were kind of making sure that the income shares were distributed in a better way between capital and labor. And we've seen all that kind of like, I mean, got dismantled as the 20th century went by. And now we're in a situation where we have kind of like very little kind of like organized power, you know, like, I mean, labor parties around the world are kind of collapsing precisely in part because of that. The economies are moving, you know, from industries to services, and then it's a lot harder to organize. And then we gotta ask ourselves, you know, how do we kind of like organize societies and organize kind of like, I mean, the different elements that will allow us to achieve kind of more equal societies. And what's the role of civil society in that? What's the role of decision makers in kind of like, I mean, the public administration? What's the role of academia and the like? And I think very often we tend to focus on technical solutions, you know, like, oh, we need to raise the minimum wage, or in some cases, you know, or we need to raise more taxes, and we need to, and like all those kind of solutions that we know are needed, you know. But then the question is like, what you keep mentioning, the political economy thing. So how do we change that? And I think that's where we still don't know how to get there. You know, how do we kind of like, I mean, revamp our decision-making processes? You know, like our democracies, our institutions, so that the public investments and the private regulations, or the regulations of the private sector, actually benefit more people and not just a handful.
So let me pick on a couple of things that I think are important. One is, this is obviously a conference on the intersection, I think, primarily between research and impact. But of course, teaching is something we also do in universities, and many of us feel passionate about. And I think what you indicated is important to also remember that one of the things that we should help create is more technopoliticians. So people that are not simply politicians. Oxford has been, I was going to say, very good at training some of them, maybe very bad to train some of them in the UK, but and trains a lot of technical people, right? People that then go to do policy design, etc. I don't think we are always as good as thinking about how we trained the intersection between the two, how we trained people that are technically skilled, that know how to think about some of these policies, but that always thinks about the politics behind those policies as well, in how to package and how to think about those. And I think the more, not just in the Blavatnik, but in my own department, in geography, and others, we think about that intersection between the political economy and the technical, the more we will be able to change debates internationally. But I also wanted to ask you something, Ricardo, because of course in that process of change, narratives are very important, and I think Oxfam, thanks to primarily to you, frankly, was extremely good at using some of the data that had been produced to actually package a different narrative around inequality, and to use it very strategically in places like the World Economic Forum. So this we had not prepared, but I wonder whether you could tell us a little about how that process went. How did you guys think about doing that? How you thought strategically about using the World Economic Forum, and what you think was successful, but also less successful, or you would have done differently in that process?
Yeah, no, thank you, Diego, for that question. I mean, when we released that paper, I was the head of research at Oxfam, Great Britain, so I was living in Oxford at the time, um, and initially, kind of like, the whole idea was, how do we highlight some of the most pressing problems in the world, you know? And because, we know these things exist, but how do we kind of capture the imagination of people? And like that, it comes back to data. Being head of research of Oxfam Great Britain, one of my jobs was to kind of scan permanently for kind of new data sets, and how these new data sets were kind of describing until then kind of hidden problems, or were kind of describing things that we didn't see. And I think I want to stress this point because in the last 10 years, we've produced enormous quantities of data. So we have better tools to understand and dissect and communicate the problems that in the world because of that data. So we have to kind of keep looking, you know, we have to be scanning, you know, what kind of data there are. And then this is before Piketty became super famous, you know, because the Piketty book was published in English in 2014. And we were doing this in 2013, you know, and in 2012. And I was scanning for the data. So that was the first step, you know, look for data. And I knew the work of the great Tony Atkinson, as I mentioned, and the work that he was doing with Emmanuel Saez and Piketty and that group to collect the share of income in the top end of the distribution, the 1% and things like that. But I also kind of look at what was happening with that Credit Suisse report, the Global Wealth Report, and it's a fantastic piece of work led by some academics associated to the London School of Economics. But because it's Credit Suisse and it's a bank, and people thought it's just banks saying trying to kind of communicate to different clients what's the distribution of wealth, where they sit, you know, and things like that. But actually, it was a fantastic exercise to look at how financial resources were distributed around the world, and that's how we could calculate that the 85 richest people around the world control as much wealth back in the day, you know, as much wealth as the bottom half of the population, you know, which at the time was 3.5 billion people, and that was what captured the imagination, you know. But it started with data, and I think that's very important. And it's very important in the context of this conference. We need to kind of rely on good quality data, because especially in the context where we're living, where data is ever more available. And then there was kind of this idea of where can we kind of communicate this, and then we decided it was the World Economic Forum, because that's where the decision makers are, and we wanted to kind of take control of the conversation so that they started thinking about this issue, and not kind of have this self-referential kind of discussion, but that they actually pay attention to it. Now, one of my frustrations is we did that really well, and then we Oxfam keeps doing it every year, you know, 10 years later, but nothing changes, you know, nothing really changes because of that political economy. So changing the narrative is important, but then having practical recommendations and having the organization, the kind of the social communal organization to back that up, those demands, is really important. And that's where kind of I see kind of also some progress, but not enough, because we've seen that some decision makers, some politicians, you know, have taken up this narrative of inequality, and so the most famous case is probably Bernie Sanders, you know, but then what happens, you know, why these things have not kind of led to real change in a practical way. Yeah. The way, say, for instance, Bernie Sanders would like to, you know, and that's where we need to start saying, you know, how do we demand those changes? How do we organize across the, not only internally in a country, but across the world to kind of exercise those demands? And how do we kind of keep pushing the understanding? and then I'll stop with this. I'll give back the floor to you, Diego. One of the things that really concerns me is how the inequality debate has pitted the politics of recognition against the politics of redistribution. So in some sense, it seems like different angles of inequality are fighting for attention. And Nancy Fraser, wrote a couple of fantastic books about this. So that how we're focusing way too much on one thing without paying attention to the other. Paying attention to recognition and the elements of identity, which is a super important angle of inequalities. Or how we're focusing on issues of redistribution and not looking at the two as a coherent framework. And I think recently what we've seen is that we kind of forget that without actual redistribution, the way that we've seen in the past, land reforms that redistribute land progressive taxation on capital, including inheritances, massive investment in public services that create capital, like human capital, like public education and public health. How all those things are actually redistributive policies, but then we're we don't want to talk about it because it's politically dangerous, and I think that's one of the things that we need to start looking at. We need to keep the fight on issues of dignity and recognition, but we also need to start thinking about specific concrete actions on redistribution and what are the things that need to be redistributed, and then we can continue the conversation about what are the things that need to be redistributed.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a couple of things that you said that are really important. The first is this issue of catching the imagination. It's so important, right? And so important, I think, in the context of the discussion of the last 2 days. I don't know what you guys think, but in my case, it's hard to think of many academic papers catching the imagination of anyone. And it's why it's so important, actually, things that we organize and Aileen, Heather, and others have organized, including, for example, storytelling in the social science, right? Because at the end is how you package. And I think this is connected also to a debate that was implicit in what you said about the failure, which is many times we think about the intersection between policy and academia in terms of evidence-based research, right? So academics produce evidence that then they need to give to politicians in one way or another, and then that will change policy. I think that's just a very, many of you, I'm sure, think that is a very simplistic view both of politics but also of the role of evidence itself. Evidence is a political tool in its own right, is not simply objective, and how we produce, how we sell, how we understand the evidence is important. Of course, high quality evidence is important, and that's why what you said about the data is significant, but then how we are able to link that evidence to particular stories but also politics become important. I think where you left the conversation is also important in terms of big debates that take place today around different dimensions of inequality, but also, and maybe we can finish with this and open up for discussion to the floor, on the importance that inequalities have now and research on the intersection between inequality and democracy and the quality of democracy. So we knew that inequality was a problem already, but of course the election of Donald Trump in the US, of the Brexit result in the UK, and increasing number of less than democratic leaders, supposedly elected through electoral competition, shows that this intersection and understanding this intersection is more urgent than ever before. And of course, there's a lot of debate around whether people that voted for these new leaders are primarily upset about recognition, about cultural problems or cultural dimensions, or if it's about income. And I think there's exciting work in political science and other areas about this. But probably, I don't know if you agree with me, Ricardo, the answer is that it's about both. that is about this interplay between the lack of resources or the difficulties that people have to imagine that the life of their children will be as good as theirs, together with then debates about cultural representation and other areas, which politicians many times love because it hides the difficulty of adopting some of the inequality measures. So maybe I can send you back this question of how you think about inequality and democracy, if I may say, in a country, which obviously that's an important debate as well in the current Mexican context, although I don't want to put you in any trouble to talk about Mexican politics, and then maybe we can open it up to the floor as well.
Yeah, thank you, Diego. I mean, I think that's kind of like, I mean, as this is how the conversation, the global conversation on inequality has evolved, and now we're focusing on democracy and the quality of democracy. Because, as I was saying, kind of like, I mean, the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and the movements that kind of like, I mean, came after the financial crisis showed a massive discontent with how the economic systems were working, but also the political systems were working. And then we've seen kind of like, I mean, around the world, a decline in trust especially in liberal democracies, which is really worrying, you know, because like, I mean, then what we see, what we have is like a large number of angry people, you know, that are kind of like, I mean, rightfully angry because like, I mean, the system is not working for everyone. It's just is captured by the few, and benefits go into kind of like, I mean, a small group, you know, that are connected economically, socially, politically, and then you know, it's just kind of that reproduction of benefits and privileges, you know. And then we like, the interesting thing is that we started saying that around many different countries and in many different contexts. And then people were rightfully angry, you know, but then what's the solution? The solution, so when you think about it, you know, and like I've been working on that recently, you know, when you think about what does democracy offer? It offered two things, you know, like, I mean, a liberal democracy. Yeah, it offers political recognition and dignity in the way that, like, I mean, your voice is heard and you can vote and you can kind of like, I mean, hold your representatives to account and things like that. So that's one important element. But like, as democracy kept evolving, it was also offering elements of welfare, you know, the welfare state and public education, all the things that I was mentioning, which are elements of redistribution. And that was, it's very interesting, you know, because like that was part of the kind of like, I mean, the central debate in the 19th century, you know, like what people were calling the political question, and like how monarchies needed to kind of like have constitutions, you know, that protect kind of like the political rights. And that was the political question, you know, and the economic question, you know, which we're focusing more on like standard of livings and kind of like, I mean, like what we call now the economic and social rights. And that was kind of like, I mean, a very, very, very strong debate back in the day. And then, like, I think it's important that we parse kind of like, I mean, what liberal democracies, you know, can offer, which is that kind of like recognition, but also kind of that redistribution, because we need both, you know, we need both. And then when we have this problem of massive inequality, economic inequality, massive concentration of wealth and income, it's natural that people will start saying, well, I mean, this system, what is this system offering? You know, this political system, is it offering recognition? Is it offering redistribution? Is it offering the two of them? And the danger I see, you know, with like the recognition agenda is that it's very easy to get captured. The way it was captured by the Brexit agenda, the way it was captured by Trump, the way it's been captured in India, and the way it's been captured in many of what you know, this process is called kind of illiberal democracies around the world, in Turkey and Hungary and Mexico and Bolsonaro in Brazil, you know, and the like, you know, because it's very easy, you know, you don't need to upend the system that much, you know, to kind of create a discourse from a position of power that that kind of like restitutes kind of like some sort of recognition. What's a lot harder is like to achieve both. Recognition of privileged marginalized groups with redistribution. And let's think about the Civil War in the U.S. Like the Civil War was very successful in emancipating or eliminating slavery and emancipating the slaves, but that wasn't really successful at then providing what was called kind of like, I think 4 acres and a mule, the redistribution of resources that would like free economically the slaves or people who were living in slavery, and I think we need not forget that, that without actual redistribution of resources, and these we're not talking only about financial resources. That's another thing I'm working with ODI right now. Like we need to look at kind of like the portfolio of capital, different capitals, tangible and intangible, that people possess, and these include political capital, social capital, their networks and connections, the human capital, and how they can like sell it in the labor market, and the financial capital. Because that's what determines the proper wealth, the comprehensive wealth of an individual or a family or a household or a community. And I think we need to kind of like start thinking what needs to be done to actually kind of like have balanced portfolios for everyone. You can't just like assume that by providing voice and recognition, that things will like people will kind of like have kind of those assets to create and protect kind of like their welfare. And I think that's something it's key. It's that we need to start thinking about redistribution of human capital. What does that mean? It means more investment in public education so that like not only the rich kids can access successful private education around the world. It means the redistribution of social capital. What does that mean? What are we talking about that? Well, it means that your personal and family connections don't land you a fantastic job, or recently, there was this conversation in Hollywood of all places about nepo babies. It's like how is it that, just because your parents were actors, you're also actor, and then you have access to kind of these massive kind of job opportunities. So we need redistribution of social capital in the sense that regardless of where you're born and who your family is, or where your family was in the distribution of income and socioeconomic status, that you have the equal same opportunities as someone who was born in a different strata. And like that, with the different types of capital, I won't go into each one of them, but we need to start thinking about that. I'll conclude with one that's very clear, which is the time. Time is a huge asset. And like all the care economy discussion is about how time is or leisure, is terribly distributed between men and women, and then how policies of redistribution should start looking at how to redistribute time as an asset, so that men spend as much time or more than women on care activities, because that's one of the massive injustices. But we need to think about it, because in the sense that time is a very important type of asset, and that we can need the state intervention and things like that to achieve that redistribution.
Thank you, Ricardo. And I think this all highlights the many dimensions of inequality and why that it's such an important topic to discuss politically, but also to research as academics. Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, Eileen, and others for the invitation. And Heather, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Ricardo and Diego, for a really fantastic final session. What a way to finish the conference. What I'm really pleased about as well is that Diego has summarised very nicely some take-home messages, and that saves me the effort of having to do that. But I want to do something different. So a younger, very valued research colleague of mine always ends up every meeting with me saying, but what's the action, Heather? What do we do next? And I think that's something that I want all of you, when you walk out of the doors later on, to think about. What are our next steps? What do each of us as individuals do as a result of all the things that we've absorbed and experienced and generated at this wonderful conference? So that's my challenge to you. I've now got a little bit of housekeeping. So we go from what's next to lanyards. So please make sure you put your lanyards in the boxes as you go out. Secondly, you've all got a programme, and on the back of your programme you've got a QR code, and that is your key to being able to complete our end of conference survey. So please follow that as you journey home. And just finally as well, if you open your programme, on the back page as well, in the acknowledgements, you'll see a whole raft of people that I want to thank. And this isn't an Oscars ceremony, so I'm not going to thank everybody. But I want to make 3 sets of thanks. First of all, I want to thank everybody wearing orange lanyards and everybody from the St Anne's team, from all the IT support, the catering, the porters, etc., for the fantastic service that they've given us. So first of all, let's thank them. And secondly, I'd like to thank the event manager, that's Becky Launchbury, for all of the fantastic work that she's done to get this up and running. So Becky has a tremendous attention to detail. I have known every day exactly where I should have been and what I should have been saying, and I've tried my best, Becky, is all I can say. And Sam is lurking, coming down the steps. She has something to say thank you from all of us for all the work that you've done. So please join me in thanking Becky. And finally, I'd like to thank our event lead, Aileen Marshall-Brown. I know you hate this sort of thing, Aileen, but you're not escaping. I'd just like to personally thank Aileen for having the vision to put this thing together. If there's anybody that symbolises hope into action, it is Aileen. So we don't expect a speech, Aileen. That's the end of the formal business. But please, all of you, thank you so much for your contributions and for making this what has been a really, really excellent event. So thank you.